David Larson had everything: a successful career, a family, and a life many would envy. But behind his carefully crafted facade, an obsession was brewing. Emma Phillips, an 18-year-old girl new to town, was about to become the catalyst for a tragedy that would tear apart lives, shatter a family, and leave a town questioning how well they truly knew the people around them. What started as an innocent friendship would soon spiral into a deadly secret, one that no one could have predicted. David Larson was a man who had it all, or so it seemed. At 40 years old, he was well established in his small town as the owner of a successful construction company. He lived in a comfortable home with his wife, Lisa, and their 2 young children. To outsiders, David was the epitome of the American dream: a loving husband, a devoted father, and a respected businessman. He carried himself with confidence, always dressed sharply, and maintained a friendly smile that made him well liked among the townspeople. Yet beneath this facade, David harbored a deep dissatisfaction that no one could see. He had grown restless in his marriage. Over the years, the spark that once existed between him and Lisa had faded. They had become more like roommates than lovers, and David found himself yearning for something more. Despite his outward success, there was a void inside him that he couldn't fill, a longing for excitement, adventure, and perhaps something forbidden. It was during this period of discontent that he met Emma Phillips. Emma, an 18-year-old high school graduate, had recently moved to the town to live with her aunt after some personal issues at home. She was new to the area, eager to make a fresh start, and a stark contrast to the life David was leading. Emma was bright-eyed and full of youthful energy, her face still holding the remnants of childhood innocence. She was the kind of person who radiated positivity, someone who looked at the world with hope and ambition. David first noticed her at a local coffee shop. She was sitting alone, reading a book. There was something about her presence that immediately caught his attention: her natural beauty, her carefree demeanor, and the way she seemed untouched by the worries that weighed him down. He struck up a conversation with her, something casual at first, just about the weather and her new life in the town. Emma, grateful for the attention and eager to connect with someone, responded warmly. Their conversation flowed easily, and they soon discovered they had more in common than they expected. Over the following weeks, their interactions grew more frequent. David began to find excuses to see Emma. At first, their meetings were innocent enough. He offered to show her around the town, give her advice about local spots to visit, and even helped her with a few errands. Emma, flattered by the attention from someone older and more experienced, welcomed his company. She had few friends in the town and found comfort in the way David seemed to take an interest in her life. David, however, began to feel something deeper than friendship. His admiration for Emma shifted into something darker, an attraction he couldn't ignore. She was beautiful, youthful, and full of life, everything that had been missing from his own existence. He started making excuses to spend more time with her, calling her to chat, offering to meet her when she needed help with something. What began as a genuine attempt at friendship quickly evolved into something more intense. For David, it was like an escape from his monotonous life, a fleeting chance to reclaim a feeling of excitement and desire. Emma, on the other hand, was still young and naive. She had lived a tough life, struggling with family issues and seeking solace in David's attention. She didn't fully understand the implications of their growing closeness, but it felt good to be noticed, to be seen as special by someone who had lived a more established life. She began to confide in David, sharing her struggles with him, finding comfort in his words and his understanding. But as their connection deepened, so did the risks. David was married, and Emma was an 18-year-old girl, vulnerable and impressionable. Yet neither of them fully recognized the dangerous path they were treading. Their bond had become a secret, one that neither of them could easily explain to the people in their lives. They were both drawn to each other in ways they couldn't resist, unaware of how dangerously their lives were about to collide. What had started as an innocent friendship had become a slow-burning fire, one that would soon consume them both. As the weeks passed, David and Emma's secret relationship deepened, morphing from casual meetings to something far more intense and complex. Their once innocent conversations evolved into more personal exchanges, revealing sides of themselves they had never shared with anyone else. David, who had grown used to the monotony of his marriage, found in Emma a spark he thought had long since faded. She was everything that Lisa was not: spontaneous, full of life, and completely captivated by his attention. The more time they spent together, the more David became fixated on Emma. Her youth and energy rejuvenated him in ways he couldn't explain, and the weight of his discontent with his marriage only pushed him further into the arms of this forbidden relationship. Emma, on the other hand, was caught in a whirlwind of emotion she couldn't fully comprehend. She had always struggled with her place in the world, feeling isolated after moving to the town and leaving behind a complicated family dynamic. David's attention was a balm for the wounds of her past. For the first time, she felt seen and valued by someone older and wiser, someone who seemed to understand her pain. His kind words and reassuring presence made her feel important, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She was also drawn to his maturity, a stark contrast to the boys her age, who seemed to lack the depth or stability she craved. As the relationship progressed, their meetings became more frequent and secretive. David started finding excuses to be alone with Emma. He would invite her to meet at odd hours, sometimes late at night when his wife and kids were asleep, or on weekends when he claimed he had business meetings. Emma, naive to the dangers of their growing attachment, didn't question these late-night rendezvous. She was just happy to spend time with someone who made her feel special. The pair would meet in remote locations, behind quiet woods, in secluded spots by the lake, or sometimes in David's car parked along country roads, away from prying eyes. Each meeting felt like a stolen moment, and though Emma didn't fully grasp the weight of the situation, she began to feel the thrill of living in secrecy. She started skipping out on school more often, telling her aunt she was meeting friends, when in fact she was meeting David. They would talk for hours, often sharing their deepest fears and desires. David, who had kept a distance from his family, emotionally for years, found solace in Emma's openness. She was easy to talk to, and she seemed genuinely interested in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension between them began to build. David's obsession with Emma grew, but so did Emma's confusion. Though she enjoyed their time together, part of her felt uneasy about the secrecy and the lies she was living. She had been taught to trust her instincts, and those instincts began to tell her that something wasn't quite right. She started questioning the nature of their relationship, wondering if David's intentions were truly as innocent as he made them seem. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself in this complex bond. She found herself pulled between the attraction she felt toward David and the growing realization that their connection was far from normal. David, on the other hand, had become desperate to keep Emma in his life. His marriage with Lisa had already suffered, but the affair with Emma made it even more strained. He was no longer emotionally present with his wife, and his mind was consumed by thoughts of Emma. When he wasn't with her, he would find himself thinking about her constantly, obsessing over her smile, her laugh, the way she made him feel alive again. The guilt of his actions began to weigh on him, but his desire to keep the affair going eclipsed any sense of right and wrong. David believed he could manage both lives. He could keep his family intact while secretly indulging in the dangerous thrill of his affair with Emma. But deep down, he knew that this could never end well. Emma, despite her growing sense of unease, still believed in the good within David. She didn't fully understand the gravity of their situation, but she trusted him. She began to feel trapped in a web of lies she didn't know how to escape. Every time she thought about pulling away, something kept her coming back. She was torn between the promise of love and the unsettling realization that she was falling deeper into something that was quickly spiraling out of control. Neither of them could have predicted how their lives were about to change in a way that none of them could ever come back from. As their relationship progressed, the cracks in David's life began to show. The guilt of his affair with Emma gnawed at him, but his obsession with her had only grown stronger. The excitement of sneaking around, meeting in secret, and hiding. His actions from the world gave him a sense of power and control. However, that power began to slip through his fingers as he found himself unable to balance his life at home with his secret life with Emma. At home, his marriage with Lisa was falling apart. She had started to notice the subtle changes in David. His distant demeanor, his lack of interest in family activities, and the coldness that had crept into their conversations. She confronted him a few times, but David skillfully deflected her concerns with empty excuses. He would blame work, stress, or the pressures of raising a family. Lisa didn't know what was truly going on, but she felt the distance between them growing wider. She tried harder to reignite their connection, but David's mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Emma. Meanwhile, Emma's behavior began to change. What once seemed like a thrilling escape now felt like a burden. She had always been a girl who wore her heart on her sleeve, but the lies she had to maintain were weighing on her. She was constantly sneaking around, lying to her aunt, and skipping school. She knew something wasn't right, but the emotional pull she felt toward David made it hard to let go. The relationship had become toxic, and Emma couldn't figure out how to break free. David, too, was beginning to feel trapped. His need for Emma had turned into something more than he was willing to admit, but he couldn't let her go. He feared what would happen if she walked away from him. The thought of losing her, of returning to his mundane, unhappy marriage, terrified him. The idea that Emma might choose her future over him sparked a kind of desperation that David couldn't control. Emma, in her own way, had started to understand the danger of the situation. She knew the relationship was wrong, but she couldn't escape it. She felt powerless to resist David, even though a part of her longed for freedom from the secrecy and lies. One night, after another secret meeting in the woods, Emma tried to confront David about the direction their relationship was heading. She told him she wanted to end things, that she needed to focus on her future, that she couldn't continue living in the shadows of their affair. David's reaction was one of disbelief and fury. He couldn't comprehend why she would want to leave him. In his mind, they were meant to be together. and Emma's decision to end the relationship felt like a betrayal. His anger began to boil over as Emma tried to distance herself from him. He became frantic, desperate to hold on to the one thing in his life that made him feel alive. The power and control he once had over the situation slipped further from his grasp, and he began to panic. David had never been one to lose control, but in that moment, he couldn't stop himself. His fear of losing Emma, of everything crashing down, took over. In a fit of rage, he snapped. He couldn't handle the thought of Emma walking away from him. As she turned to leave, his hands reached out to grab her, to force her to stay. Emma, terrified and struggling to break free from his grip, screamed for him to let go. But David was no longer thinking clearly. His emotions were clouded by fear, jealousy, and anger. In that instant, everything he had worked so hard to protect, his family, his reputation, his carefully constructed life, began to unravel. The argument escalated, and the situation spiraled out of control. Emma pushed him away, trying to escape the overwhelming force of his anger, but in doing so, she stumbled and fell. David, caught in the grip of his rage, acted without thinking. His actions, fueled by desperation and a need to maintain control, led to something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The moment, a culmination of lies, manipulation, and unaddressed feelings, had gone too far. The consequences of that night would forever alter the course of their lives. David, now realizing the gravity of what had just occurred, froze. His mind raced, but no rational thought could take hold. Emma lay there, motionless, and David's world came crashing down around him. The carefully constructed life he had built, the secrets he had buried, and the obsession he had nurtured, all of it had led him to this one tragic moment. The morning after the confrontation was quiet, almost eerily so. The sun rose over the sleepy town, casting long shadows across the streets. But nothing seemed normal. David was still frozen in disbelief. His hands shook as he sat in his car, parked just a few feet away from where Emma had fallen the night before. The panic had set in, but his mind was clouded. He didn't know what to do or how to make the situation go away. For a moment, the weight of what had happened overwhelmed him. His fear of being caught was consuming, but the fear of losing control was even worse. As the hours ticked by, David made the decision to leave. He couldn't look at Emma anymore. He couldn't face what he had done. In a moment of desperation, he convinced himself that he had to stage it, make it look like a tragic accident. The lies he had been telling for months about his marriage, about his feelings, now felt small in comparison to the lie he would have to create to cover up the unthinkable. He quickly called in sick to work, making up an excuse about being ill. Then, with a heavy heart and an even heavier conscience, he drove home. Lisa was already up, bustling around the house, unaware of the catastrophe that had unfolded the night before. He forced a smile, pretending nothing was wrong. But inside, he was crumbling. The guilt gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't let his wife suspect anything. He kept his distance, retreating into his study under the pretense of needing rest. He couldn't allow himself to feel the weight of the lie. It wasn't long before Emma's absence was noticed. Her aunt, who had grown increasingly concerned with Emma's behavior over the past few weeks, called her phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. By the time evening arrived and Emma still hadn't come home, the anxiety turned into full-blown worry. Her aunt reported her missing to the police, and within hours the entire town was on edge, wondering what had happened to the young girl who had arrived just a few months ago, seemingly full of promise. The police investigation into Emma's disappearance began the next day. They traced her last known whereabouts to the woods outside of town, a quiet, remote area where David had often taken her. One of the townspeople had seen David's car parked near the spot the night before, though they hadn't thought much of it at the time. The police made their way to the site, where Emma's lifeless body was discovered by the roadside. She had been left in a position that suggested a hit and run, an accident, the kind of tragedy that could easily happen in such a secluded area. But as investigators began to piece together the evidence, something didn't add up. Emma's body showed signs of struggle, bruises on her arms, scratches across her skin, markings that suggested she had fought back before falling to the ground. The police couldn't ignore these inconsistencies, and they began to investigate further, focusing on the possibility that Emma's death wasn't a mere accident. The fact that David's car had been in the vicinity and that he had been one of the last people to see her led investigators to question him. David's initial story was carefully constructed. He claimed that he had driven to see Emma one last time to talk, to make sure she was okay after their argument. He admitted they had a heated discussion but denied any involvement in her death. He said he had left her on the side of the road after their conversation, thinking she was fine, and drove away. But the police weren't convinced. The forensic evidence, along with the witness statements, didn't line up with David's story. They pressed him further. The small inconsistencies in his account were enough to raise suspicion, but it wasn't until they found surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store showing David's car parked for an extended period near the scene that the investigation turned a corner. David, who had hoped to cover his tracks, now realized his lies were beginning to unravel. The pressure mounted, and as the days passed, his anxiety grew unbearable. The police continued their search for the truth, and as more evidence came to light, David realized he couldn't keep up the charade. The weight of his actions, the lies, and the guilt crushed him. Emma was gone, and no amount of deception could change that. When the investigators cornered him, asking him to come in for questioning, David knew the moment had come. He could no longer hide from the truth, and so in the privacy of a small interrogation room, David Larson broke down. The man who had once appeared so composed, so in control of his life, was now a shell of the person he had been. The confession came, hesitant at first, then spilling out in fragments. How Emma had tried to leave, how he couldn't accept it, how in a fit of rage he had struck her. The truth was horrifying, and David's words, though shaky, revealed the depth of his obsession and his twisted desperation. The confession sealed his fate. The reality of what he had done, what he had taken from Emma, was finally exposed. There would be no turning back. The days following David's confession were a blur. The small town that had once admired him now viewed him with suspicion and horror. The police were relentless, piecing together the story of Emma's tragic death from the evidence and David's own words. The once esteemed businessman, the man with a family and a reputation, was now a criminal, a murderer. His life, built on years of hard work and calculated success, was crumbling before him. He couldn't escape the consequences of his actions, no matter how much he wished he could. Emma's family, devastated by the loss of their beloved daughter, struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could have happened. Her aunt, who had been her guardian and last family member, was heartbroken. Emma had come to the town for a fresh start, to find a new chapter in her life, and instead, she found an untimely death. The guilt weighed heavily on the aunt, even though she had no idea of the relationship between Emma and David. Emma had kept it hidden, and the authorities later found out that she had even lied to her aunt about her whereabouts on several occasions, meeting David in secret. The small town, once idyllic and quiet, was now forever marked by the tragedy. People couldn't stop talking about it. The affair, the lies, the senseless violence, it had shaken the community to its core. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues who had once shared casual conversations with David now spoke of him in whispers. The disbelief was palpable. How could a man seemingly so well put together commit such an unforgivable act? It was a question no one could answer, and yet it was one that hung over the town like a shadow. David was arrested, his life now defined by the horrible choices he had made. He was charged with second-degree murder, and though his confession had removed any chance of an acquittal, the trial was still long and grueling. As the trial date approached, David found himself a lawyer who advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a lesser sentence. David's once confident demeanor had faded into something more fragile, a man now seeking the smallest mercy. The courtroom was a place of somber reflection. The prosecutor laid out the case against David, revealing the full extent of his manipulation, obsession, and the tragic death of Emma. They spoke of the secret meetings, the lies, and the final fateful encounter that led to Emma's death. The victim impact statements from Emma's aunt and friends were heartbreaking. They spoke of the girl who had so much potential, who had so many dreams, and how all of it had been taken away in an instant by a man who could not control his desires. David's defense, while trying to humanize him, struggled to explain the unexplainable. They argued that he was suffering from a deep emotional crisis, that his life had been unfulfilling, and that the affair with Emma had triggered a breakdown of his mental state. But the defense did little to sway the judge and jury. It was clear that no explanation could justify the act of violence that had shattered so many lives. The verdict came, and the jury found David guilty. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the judge pronounced the sentence. David was sentenced to 25 years in prison for second-degree murder, a sentence that left the town, Emma's family, and even his own wife, Lisa, grappling with the aftermath of the loss. Lisa, who had stood by David for years, was left heartbroken and betrayed. She never saw the man she thought she knew, her husband, the father of their children, ever again in the same light. The trust between them had been shattered beyond repair. The town slowly tried to move on, but the scars left by the tragedy would never fade. People spoke in hushed tones about the affair, the lies, and the horrific consequences that had followed. Emma was remembered not for the circumstances of her death, but for the young woman she had been before it all went wrong. The girl who had wanted to escape, to start fresh, only to fall victim to a twisted, destructive relationship. David's life in prison was one of isolation and regret. He often reflected on the choices he had made, on the life he had thrown away for an affair that should never have happened. The thought of Emma's bright future, stolen from her in such a senseless way, weighed on him every day. He had lost everything, his family, his reputation, and his freedom, all for the fleeting illusion of love and desire. The pain of that realization was something he would live with for the rest of his life. The tragedy of Emma Phillips served as a dark reminder of the dangers of unchecked obsession and the devastating impact of manipulation. It was a story that left everyone asking the same question. How could someone who seemed so normal, so respectable, commit such a monstrous act?